Seems now is a good time to start. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. My name is Michelle Hausmann. I'm the artistic director of Miami New Drama. And we've been doing this online masterclass sessions since the world screeched to a halt. And they've been always informative, always wonderful. We've been able to talk about different disciplines in the theater, about theater history, about what it is to be an artist, etc. But I have to say that personally, one of my favorite classes, and it was the favorite classes of many of you, was when we had the great Greg Taubman talk about Greek theater. And it was a beautiful class, and it was enlightening, it was informative, and Greg is a wonderful teacher, and I'm thrilled to have him back here to talk about Mr. Shakespeare. This is, here it is, I'm holding here the first folio, all of Shakespeare's work, which as a foreigner, as somebody who did not, speak English as my first language, always been extremely scared of Shakespeare. As a director, I've worked a few times with Shakespeare. I've read, almost all of it, but really, it is only when I speak with people like Greg Taubman that I get an insight on the understanding of this great genius, on how he transformed and revolutionized theater, how he invented the human character in a way. He brought depths, three-dimensionality, to how we think of humans, and he also invented thousands and thousands of words, maybe hundreds, that we use on a daily basis. And let's uncover all of that by first welcoming the great Greg Taubman. Greg, welcome. How are you, my friend?
I'm good, Michelle. My name is Greg Taubman. I use he, him pronouns. I'm coming to you today from unceded territory of the Lenape people called Manhattan in New York City. If anyone on the webinar has visual impairment, I am a bald man with a beard, and I've got my bookshelf behind me. My wall is painted a little pale yellow, and there's sort of half a picture of Dali Trojan horse on the wall. It's good to see you.
But wait. You can't describe without describing the main event of visually your screen right now. Could you please tell us what is going on in between your lovely ears?
So when the pandemic began, I was staying in Connecticut with my brother and sister-in-law and my two nieces, who are 1 year old and 3.5 years old. And in order to do anything with any sense of privacy, I needed to get a headset. So I got this wonderful Princess Leia contraption that is fully covering my ears, and there's a little mic coming out from my left ear towards my mouth, and it goes all the way over my head, and there are these two little blue cushions right on top between the top strap and my head that I think make me look like a little anime rabbit with my ears pressed down. But that's
a good point. But
yeah.
we have to imagine it's as if a helicopter pilot would be talking to us about Shakespeare. That's what.
Yeah, I'll try to bring us in for a smooth landing.
There you go. All right, Greg. So last we left off, we were talking about the Greeks, and you went through, the beginning of choral storytelling to, an actor leaving the chorus, to sort of the creation of this, great discipline that we call theater. And we left it off at the height of Athens, of of Dionysian festival, and sort of theater was created. And then, in the next 2,000 years, I don't know if there is another focal point of theater, that was so earth-shattering as Elizabethan England, right? Where we're going to talk about Shakespeare. So what happened, more or less? Just give us a brief, storyteller. What happened when we last left off with the Greeks, and where we're taking off today with Shakespeare?
So I do want to point out that, we have, and you and I learned in this very
Western theater. You're
Western-centric, tradition.
absolutely right. Absolutely right.
So there's an amazing flowering of theater in India, both ancient Sanskrit theater and later, and also in Japan with the creation of No theater. So there are other theater traditions that are not directly tied to the Greeks that are flourishing in between. But in the West, yeah, we think of there's this golden age of drama and theatrical composition in ancient Athens, and then the next one manifests in Elizabethan England. So what's going on there? And I think that there is a kind of society, a kind of culture that is widely cosmopolitan, that is somewhat democratic. I say a huge somewhat for both Athens and Elizabethan England, that enables there to be a class of people who can afford to patronize and subsidize the creation of theater, and then a willingness to make that theater available to pretty much everybody. So in the ancient Greek context, we didn't talk about this as much in our last class, but all of the plays were granted subsidy through prizes, and patrons would sponsor the chorus. To be a choregos was to be a great honor. You would sponsor the chorus for one of these dramatists. And then, of course, the play would be available to everybody as part of the Dionysian festival. The whole city would be given a holiday. You'd take the day off work. Prisoners were released from jail to go see the city Dionysian. So the rich are subsidizing culture for everybody. The same thing starts happening in Elizabethan England, where you have patrons like the Lord Chamberlain, or later the King. These are Shakespeare's two companies, who are, and then a class of aristocracy who are more or less subsidizing the creation of this art that then gets to include the groundlings and include everybody.
Interesting. And so before we get to that, just tell us briefly about some other moments of Western theater that sort of help lead the way to Elizabethan theater.
Absolutely. So the immediate precursors to Elizabethan theater, and you can see this in some of Shakespeare's work. Earlier on, you have these medieval morality plays, of which probably the greatest surviving example is the York Mystery Cycle.
Right.
And the York Mystery Cycle was amazing because in this city of York, all of the guilds, all of the different craftspeople would put on their section of the Bible, of the story of the Old Testament up through the birth of Jesus and his crucifixion. And everyone would have their 10-minute segment, and it would be on the back of a cart, and they would parade through town. So you just had to come out and sit outside of your building and watch the carts come by, and you would get the whole story of the Bible in dramatic form.
But it's impressive that the whole town participated, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
it was the entire city of York, because everyone who had a job, part of your labor union, part of your guild, was making part of this presentation. And of course, they were all like, if you read the plays, it's awesome because there are subtle ads for each of the guilds built into the text, right? Of course, the Carpenters Guild is going to hit hard the fact that Jesus was a carpenter.
Right, good. At least they're not hitting hard the fact that of the cross. It's good that
yes.
That's much better for advertisement. So
and
so
the other
what else?
the other immediate precursor is the Commedia dell'arte, which is this Renaissance Italian street theater. So you have and the Commedia dell'arte is very much derived from Greek comedy. The structures of all of the Commedia stories and the types of all the Commedia stories are things that are drawn out of Greek New Comedy and plays like Aristophanes' plays. But you have these amazing masks and these types like Arlecchino, or Pantaloon, who would be telling the story of essentially lovers and a clever servant who outsmart an older guy who wants to marry the younger woman, and some more doctrinaire servants. And it's played out with high comedy, high physical comedy, lots of acrobatics, lots of fart jokes, and lots of penis jokes. And it's this very bawdy comedic form that you can see laced in through the bawdiness of Shakespeare's comedic characters.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah.
All right, so let's zero in on the man himself.
So yeah, I wanted to talk about Shakespeare coming off of the Greek class because as part of talking about the Greeks, I posited this notion of a theater of imagination. That Greek theater very much included the audience in the awareness that everyone was watching a play, and asked the audience to imagine the world of the play alongside the actors, that conjuring the story was something that was participatory and that you had to lean forward into, rather than in a very 20th century form, sort of post-Wagner, post-Chekhov and Stanislavski, this notion that you sit back in a darkened room and let the story come to you and pretend that what's happening on stage is real. I think that the arc of Shakespeare's life, and particularly the arc of his plays, shows his journey as a dramatist from someone who is trained in and eventually masters a theater of illusion, a theater of trying to make stories that we are pretending are real, to someone who understands that he needs to break that form and forge essentially anew a theater of imagination. So let's talk about what the state of theater in Shakespeare's early life, because the Elizabethan theater wasn't born with Shakespeare. It did predate him. And we have dramatists like Johnson, and what's his name? The spy. Why am I forgetting this? Anyway, Tamburlaine, Marlowe. Thank you, Marlowe.
Marlowe,
Marlowe, of course, who are Shakespeare's precursors.
But Marlowe and Shakespeare worked. There were certain decades that they were overlapped. No.
Absolutely, yes. There's overlap in their career, but
Right.
there was a theater to support the kind of theater that Shakespeare
Right.
was doing, with dramatists like Johnson and Marlowe in it before Shakespeare came on the scene.
Right.
So what did that theater look like? That theater was done in these round buildings, in the open air, wooden structures, yes, with a playing space in front and a little balcony, and then very minimal sets. And at the bottom, you would have the groundlings who would stand beneath the level of the stage, looking up at it, watching the actors. And then in these rings around the outside, you would have the nobility and some of the royalty sometimes. And in that space, we are telling stories largely in verse, like the Greeks were, only instead of the sort of 4 or 5 different verse meters that the Greeks would use, we're now working almost entirely in iambic pentameter, to-tum, 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 to-tum. And we are speaking a language that sort of helps the English language sing, that follows the stresses of the English language, and follows, for some scholars and dramatists, the language of the human heart, which goes to tum, to tum, to tum. And so that all of that is waiting for Shakespeare to sort of come in and make his mark. And there is also, like in all the other guilds, a sense of master and apprentice, and that you train by learning your craft from someone who is already doing it. So some of Shakespeare's earliest plays are perhaps collaborations. We think that his earliest play was Taming of the Shrew, and you can see the commedia influence really is incredibly strong in that book.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And then he starts to sort of forge his way through these comedies and early histories. We get two of the Henry Sixes in the 1590s as well, in the early 1590s, and Two Gentlemen of Verona, another very commedia-inflected comedy. And we get his first tragedy as part of a sort of flowering of Roman plays. Something that happened in the Elizabethan era, which always amuses me, is much like contemporary Hollywood blockbusters, where you'll have like, wait, there are two movies about asteroids this summer.
At the same time, right?
There are two movies about like the White House being attacked this summer. What is going on? Similarly, in the Elizabethan theater, there would be crazes and genres. There was a craze for Roman plays. There was a craze for plays about the Iliad or Greek mythology. And you can see Shakespeare sort of subtly inserting his version of each of these things into the genre the genre phenomenon that the year was that was prevalent that year. But Titus Andronicus is one of Shakespeare's earliest plays. It's this very bloody Roman tragedy, lots of cannibalism, lots of violence. And it's also Shakespeare's most popular play while during his lifetime. It was the most performed and the most seen. I like to think of it as Shakespeare's Tarantino play. It's very much about the sort of brutality and gore and really getting into the savagery of it. And that has a precursor in Roman tragedy. Roman tragedy builds on what the Greeks are doing and just makes everything a lot more bloody. Because remember, the Romans are the same folks who have blood sports in the gladiatorial arena in the Colosseum. So there's a taste for gore that gets infused in some of the Roman tragedies that Shakespeare carries forward into Titus. But what I really want to look at here are the ways that Shakespeare's intimate family relationships and the passing of his loved ones inform his dramaturgy. Because all through this early phase, Shakespeare's already married to Anne Hathaway. He already has his home in Stratford. And he is starting to learn this craft of illusion.
Actually, let me just zero in on something here. So there's a lot of mystery surrounding Shakespeare's life. Even there's a famous anti-Stratfordian, right, who actually believed that Shakespeare, in fact, did not exist, or there was Francis Bacon, or that he was, right. And in fact, we had faculty in our own school who believed in that theory.
Yeah.
Could you just briefly speak about just a little bit about that theory, and then what do we actually know of his youth? He was, because in a way that theory goes around the fact that this man was not of noble birth. He did not go to the finest schools. Someone, it wasn't a commoner, but he was a son of a leatherman or
a glove maker. Yeah,
a glove maker, right? So like a sort of a glove maker could not know how the princess, would speak, how the king would speak, wouldn't know, so that's kind of like the basis, which is a little bit a very classist argument. But could you please tell us a little bit more about it?
Sure. I mean, so the first thing is the documentary record is sparse, right? This is not a hyper-literate time. This is not a time when taking down things from the lives of people who were not nobility about anything other than their birth, death, marriage, and property acquisitions was really valued.
And the will, we have his will, don't we?
We have his will, yes, exactly. Yes. So we have these sort of big markers in his life. We have when he was born, when his father acquired a coat of arms for the family, when he purchased the house in Stratford-on-Avon, what happened to the theaters when they moved, when he died, and what was in his will. And outside of that, we don't have his grades in elementary school because this wasn't a thing that A, necessarily even existed, and B, was a record worth keeping in that time because Shakespeare was a commoner. He was the son of a merchant, right? A glove maker who made some wealth for Shakespeare to be able to acquire the house that he did. But this was not someone of the aristocracy. This was not a life that was deemed to be important. So that is the paucity, the scarcity of our documentary evidence about the life of Shakespeare. The anti-Stratfordian arguments, I think, rest on three logical fallacies, one of which Michelle just pointed at, which is elitism. We assume that because Shakespeare didn't have an aristocratic education, that he couldn't know the things that he would need to have known to write these plays. I think that by living in a hierarchical society, you learn enough of what you need to know about the power structure to be able to portray it. Certainly, even in our culture where we pretend to ignore class and that it doesn't really exist, there's still lots of ways that we know how to put on airs or act highfalutin, even if we're not born to wealth. So that's just one example of how one can learn and one can know and one can be incredibly talented and incredibly well read without necessarily coming from the aristocracy. The second logical fallacy is a little bit of a chicken and egg. We read these plays and people say, well, Shakespeare would have had no idea how the court works because he was never in court. First off, that's a little bit of a fallacy because he became patronized by the Lord Chamberlain and then the King, King James, and performed for the court a lot. So he had exposure to courtly life.
But there was also a tradition of plays that took place in the court, right?
Exactly.
So,
yeah. And lastly, looking at it from our present day, how much of courtly life do we intuit based on Shakespeare's plays? Like there's a big chicken and egg problem there where we assume we know what courtly life was like because we have documents like Shakespeare's plays, and then some people turn around and say, but Shakespeare didn't know what courtly life was like. And my question is to those people, how do you know what Elizabethan courtly life was like? What are your sources that are not Shakespeare? And the last one is a very simple logical fallacy that I think undoes almost every anti-Stratfordian argument, which is absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, right? The fact that so much is left unknown in the paucity of documentary history around Shakespeare is not in and of itself evidence for it being someone other than Shakespeare, right? Just because you don't know something doesn't mean that thing can't be true. Right. So people will go and look at the gaps in Shakespeare's life and try to fill in gaps from Francis Bacon's life or from other people's lives and say, but look, this person can do all the things. And you're like, okay, maybe, but you haven't proved that Shakespeare can't do the things. You've only provided an alternative. And you've now given yourself the burden of explaining why this other person had to take this weird pen name or maybe pay off this commoner producer figure in order to get these plays written. And then you go crazy. Like some of these stories about like double incest with the Queen, and that's why we have to hide things under Shakespeare's name, are just bonkers. And that's the kind of knot you twist yourself into when you assume that these absences mean that someone else had to do it, and now you have to explain that story.
It's also interesting that, that you could say, how did Shakespeare know how the court work and how, the nobility speak, but also Shakespeare knew exactly well how the commoners spoke, how the drunk people behave. I think that he knows a lot of the underbelly of society that you could say, like, how would a nobleman know, know bar talk, right?
Exactly.
So you could get into that same argument. So, all right. So you're speaking about the marriage to Anne Hathaway, who, by the way, was like significantly older than him. right? She was
Yes, I believe so.
10 years. Do we know
Yeah.
anything about that marriage? Do we know why they got married? Do we know anything about that?
So what we have, which is very interesting, is the date of their marriage and the date of the birth of their first kid, and that's a manner of months apart, such
Right.
that if you do the math, Anne Hathaway was 3 or 4 months pregnant when they got married.
Right. I mean, we should also talk a little bit about Shakespeare's sexuality because it also
Mm-hmm.
um, it's a theme because of his writings and his sonnets.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, the some of them could be homoerotic,
Mm-hmm.
um,
Yeah.
which also gives Shakespeare this fascinating figure that we can't really
Mm-hmm.
grasp. But so okay, so he's newly married. He's starting in the theater. Um, what happened?
So Shakespeare is starting in the theater, and he is learning the craft of his predecessors. He's learning the craft of Jonson, the craft of Marlowe. And that craft, though it is in this very bare stage, is mostly about creating a world that the audience can believe in, that the audience can accept, right? And this is still a form with lots of talking to the audience, lots of fourth wall breaking and direct address. But it is a form that is about entering a world and going on a journey in that world. And I think that in many ways, the sort of greatest expression of that in these early plays is A Midsummer Night's Dream. So Midsummer Night's Dream is dated to somewhere between 1595 and 1596. The incident with the lion that's alluded to may have been a real incident that happened in Scotland that Shakespeare read about in 1594. And here we have this wonderful immersive world that is taking place within this Greek comic structure. Remember that we're in Athens for a wedding. Remember that everyone is going to get married at the end of this play. Um, and it happens with the Greek unities, more or less, right? It doesn't all happen in front of the palace, but it does happen in the course of one night in the woods with these mechanicals, this theater troupe, these fairies, and these lovers. Um, and it is an amazing ride. It is a really, really fun journey of being brought into a world, seeing all the things that happen in it, laughing along with people, fighting along with people. And then at the end, we get this benediction from Puck, right? If we shadows have offended, think but this, and all is mended, that you have but slumbered here while these visions did appear. And this weak and idle theme, no more yielding than a dream. Uh, that notion being that we the very play that we have watched is a dream, is a thing that happens to us in our sleep, is a thing that we are passive towards and yet still affected and moved by. And I'm going to come back and contrast Puck's epilogue with Prospero's epilogue in The Tempest, because I think they're asking for very different things from their audience.
Let me do something fun,
Yeah.
just to spice things up.
Mm-hmm.
But the way people spoke in Elizabethan
Mm-hmm.
England was not how people speak in the current London. So how would you
Mm-hmm.
say Puck's lines in the way that people would have heard it
Mm-hmm.
on Shakespeare's theater on the Globe?
Cool. Spot translation. I like it. If we mere characters have offended
No, no,
you.
no, 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 no. Sorry, I didn't expect. I want you to speak as they would have spoken.
Oh, you want to hear the accent work?
I want to hear the accent.
Okay.
Yes,
All
so I
right.
know you can do it. That's why I'm putting you in the spot.
Yeah. So okay. So linguistic sidebar. Um, the English language is a fascinating language, inflected over the centuries by many different conquests and influences. So originally we have an Anglo-Saxon Old English form that sounds very much like High German. So I'll give you just a little bit of Beowulf off the top. What way Ardena in Gerdagum Friedenge Frünon. Like that's what we're talking about when we're talking about Old English. Then round about 1066, you have the Normans, who are Vikings who settled in northern France and became fully sort of Frenchified, come back and cross the English Channel in 1066, and William the Conqueror, a French-speaking person of Viking descent, takes over England. And French becomes the language of nobility, and this Anglo-Saxon form is the language of the commoners, which is great because it gives us this like wonderful thing that happens only in English, where the name for the animal in the field is different than the name of the animal on the plate. Because while you are working in the field as a commoner, you're dealing with cows and pigs and lambs. And when you're a nobleman eating it off your plate, you're dealing with boeuf and porc and mouton, beef, pork, mutton. It's this wonderful thing in English that doesn't exist in other languages because there wasn't this language divide between the upper class and the lower class. The French inflection and the French influence on the language really starts to meld around the time that Chaucer is writing. And Chaucer's Canterbury Tales opens with this wonderful combination of continental French poetry and Anglo-Saxon Germanic poetry. So I won't bore you all with the whole first 18 lines of the Canterbury Tales, but the last couplet of that first sentence is, "The holy blissful martyr for to seca, that hem hath holpen, whan that they were seca." Seca and seca is a perfect rhyme. That's continental poetry, right? That's something out of French poetry that you want to have those rhymes. But you also have this Anglo-Saxon alliteration, hem hath holpen, that literally slows down your breath. You cannot speed through that line because you have to have 3 H's, 3 articulated breaths within it. And it really brings you to a coda within that first sentence. The translation is the holy blissful martyr for to seek, who had helped them when they were sick. So we're going from Beowulf to Canterbury Tales. And then in the course of Chaucer to the present, we have what's called the Great Vowel Shift. So vowels in the English language used to be short vowels, like an E was eh, like we currently say, but a long vowel was just an E that was held longer, eh. It wasn't what it's become in contemporary English, a diphthong, where you say iya. It's just a. So Shakespeare is writing in the middle of that vowel shift. So you have a process where the vowels are still very open and very far back in your mouth. So to go back to Puck, it would be, "If we shadows have offended, thank but this and all is mended, that ye have but slumbered here, while these visions did appear. And this wake and idle fame, no more yielding than a dream." That's what the audience, Shakespeare's audience, was hearing, something like that. For more on original pronunciation, OP, thank you, Meredith, look at the work of David Crystal and Ben Crystal. They have some YouTube videos that are amazing on OP, and it's really fascinating to listen to. It's got this sort of Irishy sound.
Wonderful. Okay, so we're in the midst of Midsummer. And by the way, I remember speaking about the idea that there was a secret behind each of Shakespeare's play,
Mm-hmm.
and that the secret behind Midsummer was that it was a gift for newlyweds.
Yeah, there's absolutely a theory that Midsummer was written to be performed on a wedding night as a gift for the newlyweds, and that is, I mean, that would certainly fit with the plot, right? That would fit with the Theseus and Hippolyta story.
Right.
And one of the ways to play Midsummer, and I think a way that really it wants to be played, is for the darkness of the marital discord
Right.
between the sort of implicit power balance and threat with Theseus and Hippolyta, the outright combat between Titania and Oberon, and then
Right.
all of the spats the lovers get into. These are ways of sort of showing this is what you're in for. This is what a marriage is. It is not just fun and laughter and joy and love. It is all of this thorny, thick, hard to manage stuff. But trust me, you're going to be okay. It's going to turn out okay. The love will carry you through. And absolutely, I think that if you're going to direct a Shakespeare, trying to find what Shakespeare's secret message is, what his hidden intention, what his hidden question is for the audience is an absolutely necessary part of directing Shakespeare. But to come back to our journey through Shakespeare's life, so we sort of hit this real peak of his ability to craft an illusion and to make an experience that is immersive for the audience, but that they still experience more passively, that they take in the story rather than participate in the story. And right after when Midsummer was written, if not after when it was performed, we don't have the first performance date for it, Shakespeare's son, Hamlet, dies.
Was a twin. Was he
With
not a
with
twin?
Judith, yes, yeah.
Right.
And shortly thereafter, Shakespeare's father dies. And not to get too deep into it, but as someone who's experienced loss like that in my own life, I feel like there's a thing that happens where the scales kind of fall away from your eyes, and illusion kind of doesn't cut it anymore. And you go through this period of disillusionment, of really trying to grapple with what is real and what really matters in your life. And that process of grappling brings us into the sort of height of Shakespeare's career and the plays that are the most beloved and the most read. It's after 1596 that we get Henry IV, Part 1 and 2, that we
Right.
get Henry V, that we get As You Like It, and Caesar, and Hamlet, and Othello, and Twelfth Night. All of these plays that now include notes of grief and include characters becoming disillusioned. In almost every one of these plays, you find a character who becomes disillusioned. And you also start to see tension at the end of the plays, even in the comedies. In the earlier comedies, everyone goes home happy, right? Midsummer, everyone goes home happy. But even in As You Like It, which is a very light and joyous comedy, you have Jaques saying, "That's cool. I'm glad y'all are in love. I'm going to hang out over here." And then it gets darker in Twelfth Night, where Malvolio is not a part of the happy ending and says he will have his revenge on everybody. These are dark notes to hit in a comedy, and I think that they're being hit by a playwright who has recently experienced a big loss and is working through what that experience means for the kind of storytelling they want to make and the kind of experience they want their audience to go on. So this is a period from about 1596 to the writing of Lear in 1604, 1605, that I think is a period of disillusionment, that we start to poke at the illusion, and we start to break that fourth wall in bigger ways and break the worlds in bigger ways and include the audience in them. So the first example of that would be in the chorus of Henry V in that opening prologue, right? Shakespeare is not asking for the conventions of Elizabethan theater to be enough. He's coming right out in the opening of that play and saying, audience, you're in. We're going to imagine this together. You're going to have to pretend that there's an army on stage when we only have like 12 guys here. And we see that gesture towards recognizing the form and breaking the form and bringing the audience into it. I think that Hamlet, to move on to our sort of next play that we're
That's like is that 1600 Hamlet?
Yeah, 1600, probably written in 1600, registered for publication in 1602.
And did the name Hamlet and Hamnet weren't actually interchangeable at that era?
So I don't think that it was as punny as it might sound. I think that there were different letters there, the N versus the L, but it certainly is going to sound somewhat similar on the ears. And Hamlet is happening after both Hamnet Shakespeare have died and John Shakespeare, Shakespeare's father, have died. And so you have this ghost and you have this son who's trying to live up to what the ghost wants for him. And there's a lot of Hamlet trying to figure out what is meaningful. What is a meaningful action? What does it mean to do something? And that's why the play, in my mind, is so contemplative, that Hamlet's going to try doing a lot of things. Like it's not a play devoid of action. Hamlet does a lot, but all the time he's wrestling with, how can I be certain? How can I really know anything?
He's thinking throughout. I mean, this is the first play where the character is just actively thinking about life and about his position in life and about, I mean, I don't know if there's any other example in theater before that in which, you know, a main character is so introspective.
Well,
right?
the only other one that I can think of, and it's one of my favorites from the canon, is Richard II, which comes slightly before Hamlet. And I do think that Richard II, what that character undergoes and the way that he starts thinking about it is a little bit of a trial run for Shakespeare to get to a character like Hamlet.
That's a really good point.
Right. Yeah.
And I just want to listen, for those of us who did not learn speaking English, I just want to give and this, I know for you it's an insult, but
no,
you know, get the No Fear Shakespeare books, because they on one page is the original, the original text of who's the famous opening of Hamlet? Who's there? Nay, answer me. Stand and unfold yourself. Long live the king. Bernardo, he. So that is how Shakespeare wrote. In fact, this is actually, and then the English translation to that would be, who's there? No. Who are you? Stop and identify yourself. Long live the king. Oh, is that Bernardo? Yes, it's me. So, in moments like this, it's actually interchangeable, but when it really gets to more dense part, especially for a director, I find it that sometimes it's useful to understand a little bit deeper what otherwise would be hard to get into. So I think one of our professors back when Greg and I were at school, Andrei Serban, said to me, and he said, people like you and me are lucky, because when we go there, we get to do Shakespeare, but not in English. So we can do whatever we want. And in a way, the moment Shakespeare is translated, you definitely lose a lot of the outside of the shiny, beautiful thing with language. But then you get to explore plot and other things in a way that might be clearer because some of those translations are not 16th century translation to Spanish, but rather a modern translation to other languages. So in a way, funny enough, nowadays Shakespeare in Romanian, in French, in English might be even more accessible, for plot and story than the original English. But
I'd also
anyways.
like to plug Michel, Play on Shakespeare. This is a project that got a lot of flack in its inception, but I think is actually really wonderful and well meant, where the Oregon Shakespeare Festival
Right.
initially commissioned modern English translations, line by line translations into modern English of the whole canon. And these are really amazing collaborations between contemporary dramatists and dramaturgs and the original text. And there's some really beautiful readings of Shakespeare that are just more accessible and provide a document for the present, how we speak, in the same way that Shakespeare's a document for how people spoke back in the 15th and 16th centuries, or in the 14th and 15th centuries. But a Play on Shakespeare, I think playonshakespeare.org is also an amazing resource for contemporary translations. But Hamlet. So I think about these plays that happen after the deaths of Hamlet and John Shakespeare as the interrogations. That's what I call them, because I think that Shakespeare is sort of one by one picking up a big idea, and after this loss, like really shaking it to demand, what do you even mean? So
And even so,
yeah.
even as we're speaking about Hamlet, and obviously Peter Brook was the first one really to it's like the first freaking line of Hamlet is "Who's there?" Right, and it's such a powerful, right? I mean, you can read it, of course, if you're directing this or acting in it. It's Bernardo is nervous doing guard at night, and there's a sound, and there's a question, who's there? But in reality, there's a subtext, which is really what Hamlet is trying to go through, which is who's there? What is, is there a God? Is there meaning to life? To be or not to be? So that line opens up that subtext of what really the play is about, no?
Absolutely. And I think that it's just such a bold thing, because in the staging of it, that character is alone on stage. You have this bare stage with one actor on it,
Right.
and you have this audience full of people, commoners and nobility. And that character says directly to the audience, who's there? He's reminding them that they are there at the theater with him, and that their identity and their humanity is a part of the experience along with him.
Absolutely. And then, that beautiful line, stand and unfold yourself. No, which also, I think there's subtext to that, right? I mean, who are you? Stand, justify your existence in a way.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's also, I mean, the problem with Shakespeare is that the moment you start to drink you go in and you can't, there's so much genius to be poked everywhere that it's hard to sort of, step back from it.
Absolutely.
But anyways.
So my pet theory on Hamlet here is that Hamlet is about the meaning of action. What does it mean to do anything? This is being asked by a dramatist who's lost two of the most important people in his life, and he's trying to figure out, so I'm making plays, but what does it mean to make a play? What does it mean to do anything? And we see Hamlet put on a play to try and figure out meaning. We see Hamlet take an action that is mistaken in his stabbing of Polonius. And he doesn't know how you can do something with intention and have it matter and have it mean anything. And we get to the end of Hamlet, and we see where Shakespeare arrives at, in at least that play, is the readiness is all. That it doesn't matter what the action is so much as that you are ready for it. And by the way, that Like the dramaturgy of that sequence is beautiful, and to me, Michelle, is one of the secrets of Hamlet. So Hamlet asks back in Act 3, to be or not to be. And in Act 5, right before this final sequence, he says, let be. The readiness is all. And to me, that is the piece that he has arrived at. We're also, that line, let be, the readiness is all, comes right after Horatio says, you know you might die in this duel, right? And Hamlet says, let be, the readiness is all. So choosing an action, choosing to do anything, at least as far as Hamlet is concerned, is, in the wisdom of one of our teachers, Michelle Ann Bogart, drawing from her Aikido training, says that there are two ways within any situation. You can go around or you can go through. And the way through in Aikido is to choose death. So Hamlet arrives at this place where to choose any action, to choose anything worth doing, you are choosing death, and you have to be ready for that. But I think the dramaturgy of this scene is also incredible, because right before that, at the beginning of Act 5, we have our gravediggers.
Right.
So we have these two commoners on stage who are digging these graves before our main character shows up again. And they have this weird sort of comedic dialogue about whether or not Ophelia committed suicide. And the older gravedigger, the first gravedigger, says, well, if she walked into the ocean, if she walked into the water, then she committed suicide. But if the water came to her, she didn't. Right? That's the basic rule that this clown gives us. If Ophelia walks to the water, if she chooses the action of walking into it, she commits suicide. And if the water comes to her, she's killed by the water. Right? She doesn't commit suicide. Remember, to be or not to be as a speech is Hamlet's deciding, do I commit suicide? Should I just kill myself? Is that the way out? So here's what happens on stage, the way Shakespeare dramatizes it. Osric, the courtier, comes in to say, hey, you want to fight a duel? And Hamlet says, sure, let's fight that duel. Then Hamlet and Horatio have this conversation where Horatio says, are you sure you're ready for this? And Hamlet says, let be, the readiness is all. And then Hamlet and Horatio do not exit. It's not like the court scene happens and Hamlet and Horatio walk into it. Hamlet and Horatio stay on stage, having said the readiness is all, and the duel comes to them. The court scene enters onto the stage where Hamlet and Horatio are already standing. The water comes to Hamlet.
Extraordinary.
Yeah, it's
the rest is silence.
The rest is silence. Yeah.
It's just, I remember just quick. I remember when we were starting Hamlet, like I called you very late and I said, listen, I have a theory. It might be crazy, but it's a theory. And I said, 14 Brass planted the ghost and knew that, listen, we planted the ghost. He knew that the Hamlet would go crazy. And that's the best way to take over the kingdom without having to and I remember you breathing, you're always you said, yes, that's interesting. That could be.
I mean, I love that as an idea. So here's what I want to do with that, Michelle, because I thank you for that, because it's been something that I've kept with me. But the actor who plays Horatio, I find this is one of the undersung roles in Hamlet. He has so little to do. So I would tell no one else in the cast and no one else working on the show this theory, but I would go up to the actor playing Horatio and I would say, Fortinbras planted the ghost. Fortinbras suborned you in Wittenberg, and you are now his spy to make sure his plan goes off. That is what I would give to the actor playing Horatio.
That's very interesting. It's a it's an interesting way around it. I mean, really, Hamlet. It's such a magnificent. It's also, you don't love Hamlet. Hamlet is not I don't know for you, but he's
Oh
not
yeah.
a likable character, right? I mean, you sort of like him from time to time, you hate him from time to time, but still you're invested in him
I mean, he's a jerk to
throughout it.
literally everybody else in the play except maybe Horatio.
Right.
And like you give him a little bit of credit because maybe he's in a grief process, but there's not a lot to recommend him as a dude.
And he's behaving like an adult, like a teenager.
Yeah,
He's this sort of like 30-year-old teenager,
yeah.
you know, going to being a dick to everyone.
Hmm.
Um, but but anyways, so
Yeah.
let's continue. So
So
we've
let's now jump ahead to Lear because I mean I could spend the next hour on all of these plays that I consider to be interrogations. Othello is what is the meaning of truth? You know, what is the meaning of honesty and fidelity? Which he calls Iago, honest Iago, so many times that the play, like we lose the meaning of honesty in that play.
right.
Um, but King Lear is, I think, the greatest and um, the most ambitious and also like daring of these interrogations and illusions. Um, King Lear to me is like a summer action thriller. There is so much in that play, and there's so much going on. But we also have this: what does it mean to see? Right? That the interrogation of Lear is what does it mean to actually see something?
Let's just briefly take a step
Yeah.
back and just in a few sentences, just tell us the plot of Lear. Um,
So in King Lear, this older king tries to divide up his kingdom between his three daughters.
Daughters.
And the first two, Goneril and Regan, flatter him. And so he gives them their bits of the kingdom. And it comes to Cordelia, and Cordelia tells him the truth. Cordelia says, I love you as much as I'm supposed to love you. My sisters say they love you with all of their love, but then what do they have left for their husbands? I'm not going to tell you that. I'm not going to lie to you. I'm going to tell you that I love you as much as I'm supposed to love you as my father. And Lear says, well, that's not good. Tell you what, you don't get any of the kingdom. I'm giving it to them. And then the two daughters, Regan and Goneril, proceed to strip Lear of the one thing that he retained for himself, his honor guard, and not host him in their homes so that he eventually, and punish his servants, and that he eventually is wandering on the heath going mad because he went from being this most powerful figure to being spurned as an elderly man by his two daughters and left out in the cold to die. And he goes mad. His loyal, noble friend Gloucester becomes blinded after he learns that the daughters are planning treachery. Um, Gloucester's bastard son, Edmund, convinces Gloucester that his true-born son, Edgar, is going to betray him. So Edgar gets disinherited and pretends to be crazy and runs into Lear on the heath, while Edmund manages to have affairs with both Regan and Goneril and climb his way up towards the throne. Blind Gloucester, finds Lear and Edgar on a heath. Edgar convinces, sorry, no, Edgar is with Gloucester. They find Lear on the heath. And Edgar convinces Gloucester to keep living. Cordelia comes back with the King of France to fight for her father and to punish her evil sisters. Lear and Cordelia are captured. Edgar fights Edmund and wins. The sisters and one of the sisters' husbands, Cornwall, I think, betrays the sister and helps the French. And the sisters are finally killed. Edmund is killed. but it's too late because Cordelia
Cordelia.
was hanged, and Lear enters with the dead body of Cordelia crying, "Howl, howl," and then sort of has this coming back to himself maybe moment right before he dies, presumably of old age. That's the general plot, more or less.
Very good. You did a great job.
Oh, I forgot Kent. Kent is very important. Kent is Lear's servant back at the beginning, or Kent is another noble who Lear exiles for siding with Cordelia. And then Kent dresses up as a commoner and helps Lear throughout the rest of the play, pretending to be called Caius. So, Kent, in that very first scene, says, "See better, Lear. See better." Remember from our Greek tragedy lecture that a theater, a theatron, is a seeing place. And that one of the ways we can think about theater as a medium is it's the medium where you can see someone see something and be changed.
Which is what Hamlet, which is in a way what Hamlet does in Hamlet, right? He procures that play that describes the death of so he's using the power of theater to be transgressive. In the same way that, listen, in Midsummer's Night Dream, there's also the play within the play.
Yeah, there's a play within a play, absolutely.
And so Shakespeare knows the power of the medium, right?
Yes, and you see his appreciation for the power of the medium change, right? In Midsummer Night's Dream,
right,
it's about entertainment, right? It's about being moved by these sort of dumb entertainers. And in Hamlet, we see that this is a place to reveal the truth, right? That you can actually learn something about someone. So Kent tells Lear, "See better." And to me, the entirety of King Lear is about what does it mean to see? What is the act of seeing actually? Because Lear, in the first scene, may have his physical sight, but he is blind to the true nature of the daughters, right? He sees only what they want him to see. He sees the masks and the show and not who they really are. And then Gloucester gets blinded, and Edgar teaches him to see with his imagination, to think that he's on top of this great cliff and that he falls and somehow survives. And that is how he goes on living. Lear, in the middle of the play, at the sort of exact middle of the structure, encounters Edgar pretending to be mad on the heath and understands that Edgar, as a naked madman, is the thing itself. "Thou art the thing itself," he says. And on the one hand, he's right, that the human body is the thing itself. And on the other, he's wrong because Edgar is not actually mad, right? He's still seeing an act. So the question is, what is the end point of Lear's journey, right? Lear begins by having sight and not really seeing the truth of anything. And then he sees a human body and he sees something real, but he's still not seeing the full truth of it because it's still being performed for him. And then we get to the end of the play and he brings in the dead body of Cordelia. And he starts to become himself again. And Kent says, the servant who disguised himself, "Do you know me, my lord?" And Lear says, "Kent, I think." And he recognizes who Kent is. And then Kent says, "But where is your servant Caius, who was the man that Kent was pretending to be?" And Lear says, "I don't know." And Kent says, "Right here, I was also Caius." And Lear says, essentially, "If you say so, call yourself whatever you want." Because the real truth, the meta-truth of that body on that stage is that it is neither Kent nor Caius. It is an actor playing both of those roles. And the character within the play, Kent, knows that he's playing one role. But the question is, does Lear understand that that body is playing two roles? And then we come to Cordelia's dead body, right? And we've all had that experience in the theater where you know the actor is alive. Look at their chest move up and down, right? Like, you know they're still breathing. And Lear will not let go of the fact that Cordelia is still breathing. And he tries to find all these proofs, a feather, a mirror. Look, her lips, he says. And none of the characters on stage can see Cordelia breathing because Cordelia, the character, is dead. But the mind-blowing question for me is, can Lear, the character, see the actor who is playing Cordelia still breathing?
The Matrix is very
Right.
interesting. It's,
Yeah.
you know, only maybe the crazy ones are the ones who see the real truth. We are all living in a
Right.
truth that we deem cohesive.
And to me, that's the only logical endpoint from where the character begins. If we're really trying to examine what it means to see, then that character goes from seeing what he wants to see and what people are showing him to being the only character on stage who is seeing the same thing that the audience sees. He's actually seeing the exact same thing that the audience sees.
That's an outstanding theory, my friend. I love it.
And this breaks, to me, the illusion that once Shakespeare has written King Lear, he cannot write any more illusions. He's broken the form. He had an illusory character pierce the veil of the illusion, see what was really happening on stage, and now he can't go back. And
so what's after Lear?
So after Lear, we have this crazy period of the late romances. And this is a period that scholars like twist themselves into knots over, because Shakespeare, we know, is a consummate dramatist. He's written Hamlet, he's written Lear, he's written Othello, he's written all of these amazing plays. And now he starts doing crazy things like The Winter's Tale, like Pericles, like Cymbeline. Pericles hardly holds together. Pericles is like a season of Star Trek, right? It's a ship going to random ports and having these encounters that somehow holds together in some kind of complete narrative. Cymbeline is similarly wild and all over the place. And then The Winter's Tale, Shakespeare breaks time. For basically the first time in dramatic history, Shakespeare says, cool, here's a story, and now here's a 16-year gap, and here's a completely different story. Here's a tragedy, here's a 16-year gap, here's a comedy. Deal with it. He is putting more on stage than the conventions of the era were built to hold. He's saying we're going to have multiple times, multiple locations, multiple genres. And I'm going to put so much in here that you cannot passively accept this as real. You cannot passively take in the story and believe it. You have to, as an audience, commit your imagination into building this world along with me. So I see these late romances as being this consummate dramatist who has been so troubled by not only the losses in his own life, but by what that's brought out of his work, that the conventions that he wrote to and the form that he learned and mastered is no longer enough. And he has to go back at the end of his career and reinvent the wheel to make a new kind of play that's going to do what he thinks theater can actually do. Which brings us to the Tempest. So if Lear is a character who pierces the veil of the illusion at the end of the play, in my mind, Prospero is a character who knows he is a character the whole way through. Prospero understands that the entire play happens in the imagination of the audience. There is no island. This is a magical island that does not exist. And he conjures all the different parts of it to help the audience see it through storytelling, through music, through these crazy special effects that don't appear in other Shakespeare plays, like the table, the feast manifesting. And it really is a play that owns in a masterful and complete way its dramaturgy of imagination. It is putting more on stage than can possibly be passively accepted there and saying again and again to the audience, believe in this with me. Invest your imagination in creating this world because it does not exist without your imagination. Ancient Athens in Midsummer Night's Dream existed. You don't have to imagine it. It helps you have the story to imagine it, right? But by the time we get to the Tempest, this is a realm and a kingdom, this island composed entirely of imagined things and imagined events. And
It is Westeros or Easteros, right? It is
yeah,
in the tradition of those. Huh?
Yes, except that we try, like George R. R. Martin mines everything he can from medieval history to say, I want you to believe that Westeros is real, right? He's trying to make that fantasy land realistic. Shakespeare is doing something much more lyrical and saying, I need you to understand that this is Never Never Land. I need you to understand that this is not a real place, that this is a place that only exists because you believe in it. And if you clap for Tinkerbell, she'll come back to life. You know, if you don't see the line from Ariel to Tinkerbell in English literature, you're missing something. So what is the purpose of this act of imagination, of this wholly imagined dramaturgy that is the Tempest? And to me, the secret of the Tempest is it is a masterclass in forgiveness. It is about not only recognizing what it means to forgive, but practicing it. So Prospero goes from wanting only revenge on Antonio and Alonso and the people who did him wrong, and maybe a nice royal son-in-law. But what he gets to at the end of the play is a willingness to forgive these people, and specifically to forgive Antonio, his brother who did him the most wrong, without Antonio having to apologize, without Antonio having to own up to what he did. And in the middle of this play, still, Prospero is saying, if he will but apologize, if he will just tell me he's sorry, then I will forgive him. By the end of the play, he doesn't need that anymore. He doesn't need Antonio's apology because he understands that forgiveness is his to grant. And most importantly, he understands that forgiveness is an act of imagination. So having gone through this story that Shakespeare has written in these 5 acts, where Prospero learns how to forgive, learns that he has to imagine the sufferings of others, that he has to bring them into being through his imagination in order to forgive them, we then get this epilogue, which is, I think, one of the most beautiful things ever written in the English language. I'm going to read it to you now. I'll do it in modern pronunciation, if that's all right, Michelle.
Yes, sir.
Now my charms are all o'erthrown, and what strength I have's mine own, which is most faint. Now 'tis true, I must be here confined by you, or sent to Naples. Let me not, since I have my dukedom got, and pardoned the deceiver, dwell in this bare island by your spell, but release me from my bands, with the help of your good hands. Gentle breath of yours my sails must fill, or else my project fails, which was to please. Now I want spirits to enforce, art to enchant, and my ending is despair, unless I be relieved by prayer, which pierces, so that it assaults mercy itself, and frees all faults. As you from crimes would pardoned be, let your indulgence set me free. So Prospero, after having forgiven Antonio, turns out to the audience and says, look, guys, the play's almost over. I know the story says I go to Naples, but I don't actually get to leave this island and go to Naples unless you imagine it for me. I need you to imagine me leaving. I need you to breathe your breath as the wind in my imaginary sails. I need you to clap your hands to show me that you are imagining that, and that by imagining me leaving and going to Naples, you are forgiving me. You are forgiving me for the harm I've caused these other characters. You are forgiving me for anything that I've done in this play that has wronged you or offended you. And your act of forgiveness is an act of imagination. You imagine me leaving this island right now. And that is your act of forgiveness. As you from crimes would pardoned be, let your indulgence set me free. So we have this lesson that Prospero gives us in his own journey towards forgiveness. And before we're allowed to leave and pretend like that's just his journey and not ours, he turns out to the audience and says, and now you need to practice this. I need you to forgive me. And that forgiveness is an act of imagination.
What a long trajectory
Yeah.
From Taming of the Shrew to that, right?
Right. Yeah, we're going from here is cruelty as comedy in Taming of the Shrew, right? Through here is illusion as wedding blessing in Midsummer, to here is dramaturgy as interrogation, right? Hamlet and all of these great plays as what does it mean though? What does it mean? And then we get to Lear and we see that we cannot arrive at meaning through illusion. We have to break the illusion. We have to start with what's true. We have to see better. And once we can see, then we can start to imagine and we can start to make meaning as opposed to just looking to receive it. We can make meaning through our imagination. And the meaning that Shakespeare asks for in his final solo composition is forgiveness.
Well, this is absolutely beautiful. This should probably be the end of the lecture part. We will open now the doors to the question and answer section. I've read a few on the chat section, and I can go through them. But ideally, please, if we can do it in the Q&A section, that's easier for us to look at it. So Barbara starts, asking if you could address briefly, Shylock at some point from the Merchant of Venice,
Sure.
which also, you and I being members of the tribe, mm-hmm. It has, of course, the characters also, been accused of classical Jewish cliches and and so there's some accusation of anti-Semitism in that play. Could you talk just briefly about it?
Absolutely. So the Merchant of Venice is like one of these asteroid White House attacks, like confluence plays, where there was a trend for a villainous Jew play, most notably Marlowe's The Jew of Malta, before Shakespeare wrote The Merchant of Venice. So Shakespeare is writing into a trope and he's writing into a genre that people want to see. Merchant of Venice is a beautiful play, but it is highly problematic and in my mind basically can't be performed anymore. But what Shakespeare manages in The Merchant of Venice is a factor of his unique talent and his unique capacity for, as Michelle pointed out, the creation of sort of full human beings. In The Jew of Malta, the Jewish character there is this really like snidely whiplash, like evil character who just wants to screw over everyone in the play. In The Merchant of Venice, Shylock is very much a human being who is part of a persecuted minority. And his persecutions get so ramped up over the course of the play to the point that his fortune and his daughter are stolen, that the way that he behaves and the way that he expresses himself about not being able to control his rage in the courtroom scene are so human that it really, to me, makes the play almost performable, right? Mm-hmm. It takes this character who is structurally a villain. He is absolutely the villain in this comedy. And gives him so much humanity that you cannot help but sympathize with him. But to me, none of that really redeems or makes up for the anti-Semitism of the play and the fact that structurally it is still a comedy, and that Shylock's conversion at the end is not problematic for Shakespeare's audience. That was a happy ending for them. And I just don't think that the structure of the play allows us to really, like, we have to fight what Shakespeare wrote the play to do in order to make it a play that that can be performed today, with the understanding that that conversion is a horrific punishment.
Is there any other play of Shakespeare that you think that might not be appropriate or to produce today?
I mean, I think there are a lot of problematic plays. I think Taming of the Shrew is highly problematic. I think Othello is highly problematic. Yeah, there are definitely, Measure for Measure is deeply, deeply problematic. Like there are plays in the canon that were not written for our sensibility and that actively fight with it.
Right.
So I think that,
which could also be interesting to explore, right? I think.
Yeah, it's still. I'm not saying that they're not worth staging. I'm just saying that you are going against the project of the play to stage them in a way today that is actually going to be a pleasant and worthwhile viewing experience for an audience.
Right. So there's another question here in the chat section about expand the idea of Horatio as a spy of Fortinbras. And so I would just say to that sort of stems with the idea that, look, how did the play end? The play ended by Fortinbras taking over the kingdom without having to fight for it, right? So, when the play starts, there is the rivalry between the two kingdoms, and the possibility of a war. And so there was sort of like a conspiracy theory that I told Greg about. Listen, what if this whole thing was just a smart political plot for the kingdom? That Fortinbras was leading by trying to take over a kingdom that had just lost its leader, and then creating this conspiracy theory in the son that maybe it was the uncle who had killed the father, and here's the ghost of the father telling the son to seek revenge. So, in a way, it's a very, I think Vladimir Putin would take one or two things from it, trying to create division within, so then it's easier to take over, like he did in Georgia or in other places, United States. Right, Greg? Do you have any other?
Well, I would just say, Michelle, that the play supports that reading, right? It doesn't fight that understanding of it. The question for a production is, if you really want the audience to get that story, rather than have it be a secret that the actors share that is fun for them to bring into their performance, does it de-emphasize Hamlet's journey to the point that a lot of his text becomes boring, right? So it's absolutely a reading that the play supports, and you could stage it that way. I think my only question is, how much weight do you give it in terms of the audience's experience, and what does that do to what the rest of the mechanics of the story are?
And obviously it would, it might not be the correct reading of it, but it's a possible. Like, I was excited because who at the end gains the most? What did they have to lose to gain it? And then you think, like, well, this is very simple for Fortinbras. The job was done for him. Anyways, so we have, please address the depths and complexity and variety of the female characters he has created. How did he know all that? Okay, he was a genius. That's Emily Rosenthal.
So, I can't speak for what was happening inside Shakespeare's head more than I already have. But first off, he did have his daughter Judith, and you see a sort of relationship with daughter figures get more expanded in the late plays. He certainly had his wife, Anne Hathaway, though she did not move to London with him, from what we know. And and his mother and what those figures meant to him. But I think the simplest answer is actually one that, to speak to Game of Thrones, George R.R. Martin gave when asked a similar question by an interviewer. So the interviewer said, you have all of these rich and different and complex female characters. How do you write them that way? And George R.R. Martin said, well, I like to begin with the premise that a woman is a person. Uh, and I think that, any artist with real sensitivity, any artist who's going to challenge people to see the way that Shakespeare challenges his audience to see, is going to embrace the fullness of motivation and dimension and humanhood of a woman the same way that he would as a man. I think it speaks, unfortunately, to um, uh, the currents of patriarchy and misogyny in our own culture that this is even a question worth asking, right? The notion that we got so inured to female characters who were just there to be eye candy or one-dimensional begs a question of a great writer. Well, how did they not do that? And I think the better question is, why did we accept not that for so long?
So Meredith is asking, and you got to help me pronounce this word. So when the full trochee, right?
Yeah,
that's right. Never, 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 never is stirring the poetical pot backwards to break the illusion.
Right. So Meredith is making a really nuanced point here that is something we didn't really get to. But because Shakespeare is written in verse, he is using a lot of that verse to help tell his story. And the basic thrust of that is the I am, right? The I am is to tum, to tum, to tum, to tum, to tum, to tum. To house is both alike and dignity, right? And we just get that beat going, which means that whenever the beat gets broken, it's like syncopation in jazz music, right? It's really meaningful to have a break from to tum 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 tum to tum to tum to tum to tum to tum, right? Tumte is a trochee.
Right.
It is long short. So it could absolutely be read that Shakespeare is using the change in verse and the shift from an iambic string to a trochaic string to really bring the audience's ear up short and get them to pay extra attention, to get that line to be extra meaningful. And sure, you could read it as trying to break the illusion. If the illusion is something that we get lulled into with to tum, 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 to tum. That can be like a lullaby. That can be something that sort of leads you into a more passive acceptance of something, which is why you break it to sort of break that passive acceptance, to shock your ear out of the pattern.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. So we have Emily Rosenthal asking another great question. What were the relationship that so deep in Shakespeare's understanding and appreciation for the depth and complexity of his many varied women character? Was it his keen observation skills alone, life experience, or something deeply intrinsic in his genius? I've just played Rosalind in a reading group. She is only one of many great women characters I've read, all different and all so amazing nuance. We sort of responded to that question already.
Yeah,
But if you wanna...
I mean, what I want to say, because this is a little more detailed, is first off, I don't know exactly what his relationship with his mother or his daughters or Anne Hathaway was, or any of the other people he might have slept with while he was in London. So it's hard to speak to what relationships he had and what friendships he had with women in London as well, with these innkeepers, right? There's so many wonderful innkeepers who were these rich characters. All like, I don't know what women in particular informed him. Certainly Queen Elizabeth did to a certain degree. But again, I think what's interesting about this question is, why don't we ask it about Hamlet? Why don't we ask it about Richard II? We don't ask how did Shakespeare have such a nuanced and fascinating grasp of men? And to me, I think it is just, it's not just that he's a genius to understand women, it's that he is a master craftsman and a keen observer of the human condition. And he starts with the premise that a woman is a person, which, again, like we should all be starting with.
So when we read The Tempest in my Venezuelan high school, that's not me saying, by the way, somebody else had a Venezuelan high school Shakespearean experience. When we read The Tempest in my Venezuelan high school, long time ago, the literature teacher's interpretation was to review it from the perspective of Prospero being a settler who came to America, and Caliban being exclaimed native, who said, "You taught me your language, and you taught to curse in your language." Would you agree with this reading? He's asking.
Yes, and so again, I think these plays support many readings. It is absolutely true that there was a story of a shipwreck in the Bermudas prior to Shakespeare's writing of The Tempest that made it back to England, and was probably something that inspired the writing of The Tempest. So we do know that exploration of the New World was in full swing. Shakespeare would have known about the shipwreck in the Bermudas, and there is some evidence to suggest that people would sometimes bring back a preserved corpse of a Native American, speaking of the horrors of colonization, to sort of show in the sort of carnival freak show circuit, and like, look at this wild, savage person from the Americas. Again, like, we got to try and extend humanity to everybody here, which is what Shakespeare's ultimately trying to do in Caliban. But that colonial vibe was certainly in the atmosphere. Shakespeare knew it was underway, and the Tempest is unambiguously a colonial play. Right. I don't think that's the only strain in it. And I think the question with any content that a dramatist picks up is, what are you using it to do? So Shakespeare is taking this colonial content, but what is he doing with it? And to me, we answer that question with he's telling a story about forgiveness, ultimately.
Well, I think that was the last question for today's session. Greg, I can't tell you how much I enjoy talking to you. It's always, I know it's going to be exciting and eye-opening, but it always exceeds my expectation. And I think we should figure out what is the next subject we're going to discuss. Maybe we do Moliere.
Yeah, we could do some Moliere. We could do some Chekhov.
We can do some Chekhov. Let's do Chekhov. That's it. You got me, and I just came off last year of doing a Spanish version of Uncle Vanya, so I got my Chekhov, very fresh. So that's exciting. So we'll shake on it with the blessing of Mr. Shakespeare. Then we'll do Chekhov now. There's a vital question that came in. Can you speak a little bit about the character of Mercutio? It's unclear as to why he's so moody and yet so insightful, very unlike Romeo. My students always struggle with it, with that character.
So I love Mercutio. I have a special secret about Mercutio as well. And I think it is part of directing Shakespeare that you want to find these special secrets about the play so that you have some juice that you're bringing to it. So right up until the murder of Mercutio, Romeo and Juliet is structurally a comedy. Right up until that point. Everything about it is a comedic setup. And then Mercutio dies, curses both their houses, and then it's a tragedy. Mercutio derives from Mercury, Mercury being the Roman name of the Greek god Hermes. And Hermes is a figure in the comedic tradition. Dionysus is the god of theater, but Hermes also figures largely in comedies. And Hermes, so there were statues in ancient Greece called Herms that had the head of Hermes and then a pillar and then a phallus. And Hermes was a
Were they
comedic god.
functional? Is that a functional
So
killer? I mean,
they
it's
were viewed as border markings and as sort of warnings to keep bad spirits out. Like,
okay.
uh,
It's not to interact with.
no, they're not sort of there
Okay.
along the road in case you're feeling bored. Um, but Hermes and the notion of the phallus figure into the comedic tradition as well. And so, in my secret of Romeo and Juliet, what we are seeing is one of the patron gods of comedy, Hermes, in the play until one of the characters offs him, and then it can't be a comedy anymore because one of the patron gods of comedy has been offed.
That's a beautiful reading of it. That's an amazing reading of it. So there's a few more questions about how
Mm-hmm.
if they can watch it, if it's on YouTube. Yes, if you go to colony.org, you go to the MasterMiND classes, you'll see there all the next classes that we have, and there's a button that will take you to the archives. And in the archives, you are going to see links to absolutely every class. We've done maybe almost 50 classes so far. You'll see a link to all of them. They now live on YouTube. So there's, probably 100 hours of great conversation about theater for free, available for all. And Greg, when you're just describing why the success of Elizabethan England and of Athens, it was that there was um, a lot of patrons for the arts. That is why there are people who art was able to flourish because there are people who would patron Shakespeare and his troupe.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's a very subtle way, I think, to talk about how you can support Miami New Drama and many other organizations. But in this case, we provide all these classes for free. But if as Spock would say, it's in your heart to all this imagined fun that we've had. You can text, mind, MIND, to 56512. So that's MIND. Just text that to 56512. Or visit colony.org. There's a Give Now page. And listen, as you know, we're not able to do the magic that we do, but we are able to provide, continue our conversation with our community with great lectures like this one. You heard it here first. Next with Greg's going to be Chekhov. And thank you all for coming. Greg, you are amazing. Do you you leave on social media? There are questions here about how to follow you on social media. Could you share with us, in what platform you're in and what's your handle?
Sure. So the best way to find me out in the internet is through my arts consultancy that I run with Chie Marita. We are Forge NYC, and we are on Facebook as Forge NYC, at Forge NYC, and we are on Instagram at Forge_NYC.
Wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
Greg, my friend, always a pleasure. You really you bring it home, my friend. But listen, you're such an erudite. You got a question out of nowhere about Mercutio, and boom, you brought in all this knowledge. You really are an extraordinary source of wonderful theater nuggets and all this. You have a really clear historical story of theater that allows you to just go in and out as you need, and that's enviable, my friend. So I'm glad I have you as a friend and as a quick phone call away every time
Absolutely.
I get this place about this conspiracy theory, and you're always there to to support it. So thank you, my friend. We'll then speak shortly about Chekhov. We'll get your vodka bottle, because that's we're gonna have to drink as we go through the old doctor's place. And thank you so much, my friend. Thanks everyone.
Thank you for having me, Michelle.
check in colony.org to see, to see what's next. Dr. Taubman, thank you.
Thank
Thank
you,
you so
Michelle.
much, Greg. You're outstanding. Thanks, everyone. See you all soon. Bye.